What's going on, Tamers? It's me, Old Man East. Been doing commentary for Street Fighter 6 recently, as well as traveling quite a bit, and if there's anything I've learned recently, it's that esports is a young man's game. But you folks aren't here to listen to me talk about the good old days. Actually, considering the topic of this video, maybe that's a lie. We're at the eve of BT14 Blast Ace's release as of the recording of this video, which means the BT13 meta is drawing to a close over here in the Asia region. I thought it would be a good idea to do a quick retrospective, a quick look back at this super long meta that we've had for this set. Despite this set being so long though, it never ever felt stale for me. I feel like we got little additions here and there that always kept the game fresh and interesting, and because of that, this set is a little bit different than others because it feels like it has different eras, so to speak. And so in this video, we're going to take a look at each of these eras separately, as well as take a look at the BT13 meta as a whole and see what takeaways we can get from this. Because I think there's a lot of things that might not be obvious about this set that may make it different when it releases in the West. So with that, let's begin the official Asia meta retrospective for the BT13 versus Royal Knight set. What a nice guy. I even made these folks a PowerPoint. So first off, let's talk about the time period, because like I said before, a lot of things happen in this set despite there not being a major bonks release for the last 4 months. First off, we got Greymon X Antibody added to the restricted list, and then we also got the new training cards as well as Mulligan added to the game. Big dub right there. And then to close out the set, we got the new starter decks, the black and purple decks that feature the new ace cards with the counter mechanics for the game. And then we also got the second wave of restricted lists, which included things like the Weird Garurumon, as well as the Impmon deck. So with all those things taking place in the set, it was kind of hard for me to split this into like somewhat even chunks, but despite that, this is what I've come up with. I think that we can consider the first 8 weeks the vanilla era of BT13. There wasn't any crazy like training cards, there weren't any ace cards, nothing like that. It was just like the raw BT13 set. After that, from weeks 9 to 13, we got the addition of the new training cards as well as the other promo cards that were released alongside them, and I think this changed up the game a lot. Around this time, we also got Mulligan added to the game, and it changed the consistency of decks to the point where I think that we can consider this its own like specific time period separate from the first 8 weeks. And then finally, we have the post-starter era. This is the time where after the starter decks had just come out, where I think that things were changed just enough to consider this its own specific era. Keep in mind that this time period does include bits and pieces of the second wave of restricted cards, things like the Blossomon, things like the Impmon I said before, and the Weird Garurumon as well. So I think this also tweaked the results just a little bit at the same time. So with that said, let's dive into each of these eras specifically. The first one, again, the vanilla era. We saw the top 10 decks here, Shine Greymon, pretty dominating over the course of this set, and then followed not so closely, but kind of closely behind it is Royal Knights. Royal Knight's probably one of the first actual expensive decks for the game, but outside of that, it just presented a wall to a lot of other decks that was sometimes insurmountable. This deck paid homage to those older decks in the beginning of this game's lifespan, those old Mega Zoo decks where you would play out big Digimon for a really expensive cost, but you would also get big effects from them as well. Right under that, we saw Belphemon, which I think one of the reasons that we saw Belphemon up here is because the deck was so cheap and the power of it was actually surprisingly pretty high. I think not a lot of folks had this deck on their radar when the set came out, but it seemed like very quickly that this deck ramped up in strength. As well as some old favorites like War Greymon, Bilzamon, Hunters, decks that had already been around. And there was this underdog, no pun intended here, Mirage Galgamon, which didn't see a ton of success, but would likely see that later in the set. And then to round out this list, counter decks like Blue Flare emerged to take out things like Royal Knights with the addition of cards like Sorai, as well as decks like Red Hybrid, which didn't have a ton of defensive potential, but the offense for that deck really carried it. A thing that I think is really funny about this top 10 is that the most expensive and the least expensive deck are right next to each other in the top 3. The most expensive, of course, being the Royal Knights deck. In a lot of cases, people were actually making full alternate art sets for that deck, which is pretty wild. And then right under that was Belphemon, which is pretty much self-contained within this set, all the cards you're going to need, and they're actually really cheap to build. I think the one important thing to keep in mind when you're looking at this top 10 right here specifically is that it doesn't include any decks with training cards in them, and that is actually going to be our next era. That is the post-training era here. And the addition of these new promo cards were incredibly powerful. We saw like a mono color deck boom around this time period. So Shine Greymon here still very strong, but arguably like even with it neck and neck Mirage Galgamon, the ability to actually grab tamers off of the use of those training cards is so impactful. In the past, they would have to play like a blue memory boost, and if they saw like a Thomas tamer there, they would have to just bottom deck it because you can't grab tamers with the memory boost cards. But with the addition of the training cards, that got thrown out the window, and then the deck became way more consistent. Bilzamon was a deck that I didn't personally think was going to get a big buff from the use of the new training cards, considering they're just milling everything, but it seemed like this deck actually super benefited as well, and like shot up to like rank 1 for a couple weeks there. And then right below that is War Greymon, a deck that I thought was going to fizzle out because the loss of the X Antibody Greymon was actually pretty big, but they got the new training cards to make up for that, and the deck just shot right back up to the top. So you can't keep a good Greymon down, that's for sure. Machinedramon was one of those few decks that actually saw a buff from not only the training cards, but also the other promos released alongside that. In this case being the black-purple rare mon that allowed you to discard a card and then draw 2, and it was considered a cyborg, so it fit into the deck perfectly. And then once you go out of this top 5, it's going to be a lot of decks that we saw in the vanilla era, things like Blue Flare, Royal Knights, Hunters, Belphemon still, and then there's a 3-way tie between Red Hybrid, Crossheart, and Bloom Quartz. You know, on the topic of Bloom Quartz, I was wrong here. I really thought that Rosemon was going to take the spot here for green, but that didn't seem to be the case. And that's going to bring us to our last era, which is the post-starters era. This is the time period where the new ace cards and the new starter deck cards are out in circulation. And of course, one of the decks being Agumon focused means that War Greymon was going to see a buff as well. This is around the time that the War Greymon beatdown deck became really popular. If you want to know more about this deck, I did a really interesting video about Digimon and like their pot of greed problems, so take a look at that video if you want to know more about this deck specifically and kind of what it does and how it's so strong. But then right under our War Greymon Overlord, Shine Greymon and Mirage Galgamon neck and neck here yet again. Again, Shine Greymon having access to not only the red trading cards, but also the yellow trading cards made that deck super powerful. And then as we go down this list, it's going to be decks that we'd seen before previously. Things like Beelzemon, Royal Knights, Machinedramon. Machinedramon was another deck that also got buffed from the new starter decks because a lot of the cards in the black starter deck specifically were also cyborg type cards that they could take advantage of, specifically the level 5s. And then as we drop down to the lower parts of this top 10 here, we're going to see decks like Gallimon, which we hadn't seen before. And this is one of those decks that you could build a ton of different ways, and I think had just been a sleeper for a long time until people really started to explore what it could do. Now keep in mind that they got access to the new Gallimon in this set BT13, which is a secret rare, and it can attack, wipe the board immediately like 2 times, and you can also reduce its cost based on how many cards are in both players' trash. And what's incredible is that's only one way to build that deck. There's another way that was just getting explored right at the tail end. I'm talking just these past couple weeks here, called Gallimon LO. Thank you, Javi, for actually telling me what this actually means. The LO means library out. So when you see Gallimon LO, it's a Gallimon deck that's solely focused on decking out your opponent. Even within this era, this deck saw a ton of changes, thanks in part to the efforts of the player Omito over here in Japan, known more as a Dear Boromon fan, but he played this deck a ton and made lots of changes, including adding things like Lilithmon and Jack Raids to really like ramp up the ability to deck out your opponent in a single turn. The last big change I want to note to this top 10 list is the addition of Garurumon X Antibody. Now Garurumon X Antibody saw a resurgence because of some of the new cards that they got in the purple starter deck. And what's really crazy is that right before the restricted list hit, there was this little time window when we could play like the old Garurumon with some of the new cards, and it was absolutely cracked. You could die like 3 turns if they got a good enough opening hand and you didn't have any like defense set up on the board at the time. And so after taking a look at all 3 of the eras, I want to take a look at BT13 as a whole. We have a total of 1,109 games recorded in the results, and you can see the top 10 for the entire set here. Shine Greymon with 151, War Greymon 106. They made a big jump in that second half after the first 8 weeks, thanks to the new training cards. We see Royal Knights, Beelzemon, Mirage Galgamon, Belphemon, Hunters, Blue Flare, Machinedramon, and there's a 3-way tie for last place, which is Alphamon, Crossheart, and then Red Hybrid. Honestly, if I'm thinking about this set as a whole, it was a pretty good meta. Lots of strong decks out there, but those decks were not without counters. Things like Blue Flare, things like Machinedramon, were able to check decks like the Shine Greymon as well as Royal Knight. One thing that is evident though is that a lot of these decks that you see on this top 10 list do need those training cards to become very powerful. I don't think decks like War Greymon, Mirage Galgamon, or Alphamon will be on this list if they didn't get the addition of those new training cards. And like I said before, despite this set being so long, it never felt like it was stale, and I still think there's a lot to be explored, specifically with things like the Gallimon deck that I talked about before, and the Gallimon LO that I mentioned as well. What I'm hoping is that when you folks in the West get your hands on this set, you'll be able to take up the torch and then push it to its extremes where we left off over here in Asia. And so that brings us to our final win chart for the entirety of this set. Again, I've changed them up a little bit here, Mega being over 100 wins over the course of the entire BT13 lifespan, Ultimate is 70 to 99, Champion 30 to 69, Rookie 10 to 29, and then in training 9 or less wins. With that said, I'm happy that we got so much time with this set because there was a lot of fun to be had and a lot of decks to flesh out and try out, and honestly I hope BT14 is just as good. If you have any questions about the deck list for any of the decks that you see here, don't ask me in the comments below. I have covered this set for 17 weeks in a row, and I probably either cover the deck you're going to ask about on the actual video, or I posted up in the comments for those videos as well. So do me a favor, go back and watch those, or check out the comments for previous videos to find all the decks you guys want. I'm tired, man. Additionally, there's just a lot of really good resources out there. Things like the Digimon Meta website, as well as the Digimon CG Guide website. If your browser has Chrome, just translate the webpage. It's very easy, I promise. And with that, we're going to bring BT13 over here in Asia to a close. Again, I hope you folks had a ton of fun watching the videos and following the storyline of this set alongside with me. Let me know what decks you loved using in the BT13 set, or the decks that you're excited to build and use when BT13 releases over there in the West. Anyways, folks, I'm going to get out of here. Before you get out of here, do me a favor, hit the subscribe button. And yeah, BT14 releases tomorrow. I'll see you on the other side. Take care.